All right.
Welcome, everybody, to MS Office Hours. It is Thursday, April 27th. Let me please introduce our hosts.
Hi, everybody. I am Heather Cox, and with me today are my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Victoria Dean.
Hey, I'm Garrett.
And I'm Andrea Sangrio, and I'm super excited for today. We had a great Q&A previously, and we've got a phenomenal speaker with us, TH, who is one of our fast track architects, but he has a wealth of knowledge after being at Microsoft for 15 years, y'all. He just celebrated 15 years at Microsoft. And we had a great question from the Q&A. So I'm going to ask Greg to come off mute and ask that question one more time so that we get TH's answer on the record before he heads into identity is key to cloud services, one identity to rule them all. So Greg?
Yes, our question is basically around the dynamic distribution list and generating large dynamic distribution lists in the cloud and how to nest them into distribution lists while sending them out and not dropping members as that sync process happens.
Thanks. It's a great question, Greg. As you guys probably all know, dynamic distribution lists are all calculated on the fly. So as we have a large organization with a large number of people accessing the address book, that can generate a lot of traffic and a lot of requests against your domain controllers and your infrastructure to respond. And so one of the things we do to offload that is we will build a PowerShell script or another approach so that we can hydrate that list statically. So I'll have a dynamic DL that I've hidden that I don't let people look and read from. And then I will have a published, quote unquote, static DL that is updated on the fly. That way you have a more predictable model of how often are we updating it? When is that available? And if you've got to troubleshoot performance issues, you don't have to worry about 30,000 or 20,000 or even 500 people all hitting that DL and querying it and expanding the list at the same time. So it allows you to basically target kind of the behavior. Is it going to be out of sync a little bit? Yeah, it might be 5-10 minutes out of sync, but it's much better than having 15 or 20 users drop and not be able to get a message because it was overloaded on the server. And when you go to open a ticket, you're not able to repro the error. So hopefully that helps, Greg.
It does. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. So Andrea asked me to come share my knowledge. I'm a recovering Microsoftie. As she said, I represent engineering. So I'm not a salesperson. I'm not a support person. I actually am what's called a fast track architect. I help our education customers get to the cloud. I am platform and product agnostic as much as I can. So even what we're going to talk about today with identity, it's focused on being a good corporate citizen. It's focused on looking at, especially in EDU, knowing we've got other SaaS vendors to play with, knowing I have Blackboard and other LRMs, right? How do we make the overall experience as you're looking to adopt to the cloud, or you've already adopted the cloud and we want to streamline things? Identity is key for that. And so I like to start with the basics, right? Which is the pillars of identity from my perspective. Everyone thinks about an individual is really the key component of identity, but when you really think about it, your organization has an identity, things within your organization have an identity, and the individuals, right? And this makes up your identity domain because every component of this plays on each other. So like when I bring in an LRM, when I bring in something like Blackboard, right? I don't want to have to set up a secondary or tertiary identity to allow a student or faculty to use that. I want to have this notion of, and I'm going to use the Lord of the Rings pun, one identity to rule them all. And the reason we go down that path is as you think of these environments becoming more complex and the features and subsets that not only Microsoft, but Google, Salesforce, and AWS are also bringing to the table, having that single identity is going to pay large dividends in the long run. A lot of the EDU customers we've seen, and we're kind of reworking what they've done, have 2 or 3 identities out there, right? And so when you start thinking, and I'm going to jump ahead in the future a little bit, you guys all seen ChatGPT today. You guys know kind of what the power is from a search engine. but let's start thinking about personas and how it actually could be used as a tool set in education. I start wanting to associate that learning plane with an individual, meaning that if I have 3 or 4 different identities at a single university, that individual isn't going to be unique, and it will not learn my interests. It won't learn what I like to do. And yeah, it sounds a little bit like Big Brother, but the intent is with that single identity is really to seed the process of, hey, this is how this individual likes to learn. This is how they interact with groups. And so I want to make it as, I'm watching the chat window, sorry. I want to make it as interesting as possible. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ChatGPT, that's the AI investment we're making on the tools that we were talking about Copilot and some other things today. It's basically another tool set we're looking to leverage in the online space to provide richer context, richer collaboration in the tools, and really automate some So again,
they're giving you a hard time.
Oh, okay. I don't know the group well, so I can't tell. But when you look at this, this is first and foremost. Any customer I go and talk to, this is where we start with. I don't talk about the technology so much. I don't talk about what Microsoft can and can't do or what Google can or can't do. What we want to understand is, okay, what are the challenges you're having in your environment today? And if I gave you a North Star, and the North Star is, hey, we want to have this unified directory across our physical security, across our applications. This is where I start, is because I can always back the technology into these aspects of the conversation. But most of our customers haven't done this. They don't know what questions to ask if they don't know. And to be frank, from a sales perspective, a lot of times we're focused on the opportunity that's in front of us versus the holistic approach of how is this piece that we're going to involve here going to change the nature of the environment. So a lot of what I spend time on is, where are we now? What are you looking to accomplish? And where do you want to go? And I promise this is not going to be death by PowerPoint. Andrea made me promise to not talk for hours and hours because she knows how I can go. But as you guys are probably familiar with, identity, and if you're using M365, Microsoft 365, it's a subset of services in Azure, right? So Azure AD, just like Active Directory, this is the backbone of all our services, right? Office 365, Intune, CRM, they're all tied as a tick mark in Azure AD. When you look at identity from that standpoint, I have a few schools that are using Azure AD for Google, for Box, right? So they've got their Google Workspaces, they've got Gmail, and it's a seamless experience. So when we start talking about how do they want to consume these different platforms, right? I can, instead of having isolated security databases that allow these users to interact, or if people get frustrated because why can't I just share content across? Why do I have 3 people in the address list? I don't know which one to pick. Right? So having the time up front and looking at how do we want identity to be represented leads into this whole notion of zero trust. And zero trust from a Microsoft perspective, and what I like to pitch is, think about it as, I want to set up an Office 365 tenant. I know that you and I are in the same tenant, but the reality is I don't trust you. Just trust yet verify. I don't care if your ID's in the same organization. You're going to prove who you are, and you're going to constantly do it, whether you're aware of it or not. Because that's really, when we talk about identity, when we talk about security, I don't want to impact people's workflows. An educator is there to collaborate with their students, collaborate with their peers, right? And to actually build that relationship, not to focus on, well, how do I do MFA? How do I do risky conditional access, right? They want to focus on that interaction and that education experience with the student, and we want to make it easier to do it in a secure manner. And so just like we talk about with identity, the zero trust strategy starts with, how do I secure people's identity, right, within the organization? I secure the organizational boundary, then I secure the user. After I typically secure the users and know what the identity strategy is, then we start talking about the machines and the devices that you guys are bringing to the table. Whether it's a student bring your own device, whether it's a school issued device, right? We want to have intelligent policies to tell us, is this risky behavior that's coming into the environment? Is this a device that's managed? If it's a managed device or if it's a student brought device, what are the minimums that I want? I want a minimum of anti-malware and virus protection. I want certain certificates to prove who it is that can't be copied. And that builds this foundational support so that once we get those two components well understood, then I'll start talking about operational efficiency and security, and then we'll work on application security. So it all builds kind of this approach, coming back to identity being really key and saying, when I look at identity, right, I can connect. I have a lot of schools in higher education where we've got affiliate schools, and I don't know that this is the call to call them out, so I won't. But for instance, I want to have that rich collaboration experience. The model that they brought forth from on-premise AD was, we're going to divide these into fiefdoms and we're going to keep them separate. And then they get to the cloud and realize collaboration isn't quite what they expected. And so we start looking at the model to understand, why did you do it this way? Well, I wanted an easy way to identify one school from the other. And it's like, well, you could do that in your single tenant design and get that rich experience. And part of that is just understanding at a core level, what are you trying to accomplish? And 99% of the schools that I talk to, it's really about, hey, I just want to have a unique branded experience, and I want to be able to kind of isolate each school so that they have their branding and autonomy without building a ton of overhead. And one of the challenges with a multi-forest approach that some of these schools are finding out now is Intune doesn't scale for multiple tenants. So if they're trying to manage across multiple tenants, they have to do 3 deployments of Intune. Or security policies, when we start looking at security and compliance, 3 tenants mean 3 sets of policies that I have to keep up to date. And there are some limited tools out there to allow you to do it, but it's also a challenge if they want to go, hey, I want to take these 3 identities and merge them back together. How do we go about doing that while still giving them their autonomy? And a lot of what we look at today, and we kind of talk through, what's the end game? Where do you want to be, whether it's 6 months from now, whether it's a year, whether it's 2 years, but it's really to develop kind of a process to say, here's what we can do, and here's the incremental steps we're going to take. Here's the functionality we'll be able to light up to get you to this end state. And the journey is painful. I'm not going to lie. A lot of customers, oh, well, AWS or Google came in and said, we're just going to dump the data. We're going to do it this way. That's an easy way to go, but I think everybody knows on this call and probably that's dealt with this is most people want to bring their data forward. And they want to bring it in a way they can access it. They want to bring it in a way that it's secured. When you look at like our migration approach, how we bring your data to the cloud, one of the things I won't do, and if I have a vendor tell me they're going to do it, is I will not bring external permissions across. And why wouldn't you? You guys know about it. Yep, I know about your external permissions, but if I'm doing it from the context of migrating 50,000 users across to the platform, I'm not validating the users that have external permissions. And then from my perspective, Microsoft's doing a disservice to you because, well, if I'm not doing the security permissions and I'm just lighting it up, now I'm culpable for allowing access to your data because, yeah, I followed what you guys had there. But the right thing to do is let your users re-verify who they want to have external access post-migration based upon that identity. And that way, it also puts you in a good position from an identity standpoint to start having automated governance policies. And what I mean by an automated governance policy is one of the biggest challenges I think I've had as an IT admin is managing the data that's out there, managing the access and permissions. And what we've been able to do with the SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and some of the other components in Office is I take that management hurdle away from the end users. So, your help desk doesn't have to manage it, but they'll get alerts. So for instance, I set up a share with this team. That share is active. I could put a policy in place that says every 6 months, if someone hasn't accessed the data, send them an email. If you guys still need access to this, you just log in once. I just want to confirm you need it. If not, we're going to start a decommissioning process and remove your access. Same with the owner. If the owner hasn't touched this, or we haven't seen a lot of access to this, the system can dynamically look at it and say, okay, you've gone past your life cycle for this data. We're now going to instigate, do you still need it? If not, great. We're going to start calling the permission and pull it back in. That's one of the biggest challenges a lot of IT shops have with this magic tool. It's the security and compliance console, or governance. Yeah, the reality is it's an afterthought, right? A lot of times, just like licensing and provisioning for identity, deprovisioning is every bit as important as provisioning. I love people buying licenses for 365. What I don't like is coming in 6 months later and seeing 8,000 licenses that were never reclaimed because they've had people leave, and there's no complementary reclamation process on the other side. Yeah, everyone thinks about provisioning and what's important from an IAM standpoint. Most likely they don't follow up on the flip side is, okay, they left and we haven't done anything with the license. It's just sitting there and we're paying for it. And that is part of the reason we have these discussions. And this isn't really a great slide to show, but when we have the discussion on identity, it's the life cycle of that identity as much as consolidating is. What do you want to do with it? When I'm gone, do you want to keep that data behind? If the user is on litigation or legal hold, what's the policy? Do we want to keep the data? Do we want to have it access for permanently? Sorry, it's been a long day. It could be a solution for reaching a tenant object quota, right? You can set up different ways of approaching and looking and slicing your data depending on how you have heavy usage and really what's being accessed. I've been to customers before that basically were looking at, hey, we're dumping everything in our file servers over to Office 365. And you look around the room and go, okay, great. Have you guys thought about governance in your policies? Well, why? And the first thing we talk about from an identity perspective is, so John can go home or go to his grandparents' house or whatever, log in and start synchronizing data to that computer. What happens when he walks away? And it gets really quiet all of a sudden and go, okay, do you guys have any policies for retention? Do you have any policies to prevent data being synced? Because you've given them their identity, but you didn't put any governance or any wrapping policies around that. So the user could walk away with data potentially left in an compromised position where a threat actor or someone could get into it. So part of what we discuss isn't the technology aspects of it. It's really, in plain English, what's the approach? What do you guys feel is important to protect? How do you want to manage? How do you want to manage that environment? And then we'll start looking at, what tools can we bring to bear? What policies make sense? And that's all comes back to identity, right? Understanding your identity strategy. When we look at rolling out Office 365 or Azure to a customer, this is the first conversation. It's usually the hard one, because we need to build a framework for not only now, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And then we'll start going into the other pieces, which is authentication and authorization. Great, I have my identity in place. How do you want to authenticate those users? Is MFA a requirement? Great, you want to do MFA? Let's talk about the type of policies we would build and kind of how we would do that. Once I get these two components in place, which we call core for the service, then I could start talking about your various workloads. And it shouldn't matter what workload you want to bring to the table, since we have a formula future state architecture for identity. I can plug in and light up all these services almost identical with customized policies. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll open it up for questions, is the other piece is think outside of the box. And this is the hardest one I think a lot of folks have with. A lot of the cloud environments that I've seen from identity, and then I've had to spend a lot of time kind of thinking through how are we going to fix this or how are we going to modernize it, is the journey to the cloud is modernization, right? It is this transformative place. Yes, it's a system on someone else's environment, but a lot of people bring forward their technical debt, and they bring forward their legacy ideas about identity. So if you've been using Windows for 20 years, you know how domains work and forests and trust. It doesn't necessarily translate forward, and you could make a poor design decision as a result of saying, well, this is how I've always done it. I'm going to bring this up to the cloud this way. Versus, I've had plenty of discussions with customers. It's like, why does it matter the number of tenants? I don't care if this is a one-to-many or one-to-one. What I care about is what is the experience you want from a user perspective? What is the experience you want from an admin perspective, right? And what are you trying to achieve? Then we can break down and kind of look at, here's the modules I'm worried about, and here's how we're going to basically carve this up. So as Andrea has told me, and I'm relaying to you, I talk a lot. So I'm going to take a breath. If you guys have questions, also ideas for future topics, I'm totally willing to kind of talk you guys through the life cycle of the deployment, but we want to make sure this kind of topic is relevant so that we can build on previous sessions.
This is a great discussion, TH. Thank you so much. I have a question, and it's not 100% a Microsoft problem, but how do you deal with the politics of different organizations and subunits?
Yeah, in university, that is the biggest challenge yet, right? The reality is Microsoft's product alone can't fix it. Amazon can't fix it. Google can't fix it. Part of it has to be a commitment from the university to set some common standards. And what I mean by that is when we have colleges that have multiple topologies, right? I don't go in there trying to change the world and sell them on Microsoft. I don't try to undo what they've done. What I try to do is let's talk about the commonality that you guys want to achieve. So for instance, a lot of higher ed, I've got the medical side, I've got the university side, right? And there's different requirements. I've got HIPAA requirements with data. I've also got requirements for the university with PII. And so at a minimum, if they can't agree on the basics, right? If I can't agree on, I need a basic policy to cover both sides, then I know anything we talk about consolidation is going to go nowhere. And God, my English is bad today. There are a few schools that it's a struggle, right? Because they've never thought about it this way. They've always operated in their own isolated verticals, and getting them together, we've made the recommendation. Do not move to our product from where you are today in the current state. You will have a worse experience now than you did before because we haven't ironed out some of these challenges. Anything I'm going to do from an application space, right? I'm going to start with identity. And the reason we come back to identity again is I can get the identity knocked out, then the identity is going to follow. If you rectify your application first without addressing identity, then guess what? You're going to be going back to the well and redoing it. So I fixed this application. It's working great. Now I got to fix identity. Now we broke the application again. And thanks for that. It is the end user experience, right? A lot of people, when we talk about onboarding and coming from different services, it is twofold. One is the end user experience. How is this going to impact them? How many times do I have to touch their desktop? Is it going to make them unhappy? But it's also the admin side of life, right? The admins are learning new tools. The admins don't necessarily know that, I like to think I'm 5 minutes ahead of the people I talk to on a call, right? I try to guess what they're going to bring up. I try to understand what they might bring as a topic, but I try to stay on task and see where they're going. And the reality is, most of the schools are all the same. Most educators are all the same. Hey, we want to protect our students. We want to protect our data. This is what the model is. I would really like to work on securing that and automating it so my admins have just as good of an experience monitoring the service as the users do. Okay, so Chris gave a question. What is your recommendation about users with one identity having multiple roles when losing one role could mean the loss of access to email? Employment or another role, student means they still need their mail. The good one. So a lot of universities, and I've done more universities in K-12, so I can talk about it from that perspective, is this notion of rotating roles, right? I don't build the identity out for the role per se. I build the identity out for the user, and then I plug them into multiple roles and the life cycle of that role, so that I could have a faculty member who's at a school who's also becomes a student, right? And there's going to be different policies that are going to layer for that student that would be different for the faculty member. My wife's going to hate me for using her as a reference, but she's not here, so what she doesn't know won't hurt her. When she was at school, right, she went to go back and get her PhD, and one of the challenges they had was this context of, well, what role is she? Well, first and foremost, she's an educator at the school, but secondly, she's a student. So the policies need, so the policies themselves need to be stacked and organized in such a way that we want the most restrictive policy and kind of approach at the bottom of that chain, right? If you think about it, like I'm going to date myself, the old days of group policy, I put the least restrictive policy that covers the broadest amount of users. That's because as I look at a policy, an explicit deny at a high level, I'm never going to be able to override that at a lower level with an acknowledge or a yes. And so I think about that with governance policies as well. I want the broadest policy that's going to affect the most people at the root. And then I'm going to start layering in these other policies from a governance perspective so that, like you said, hey, when they move as a student, certain data is going to come with them. When they lose that student identity, the process, hey, they're not going to lose their identity. We don't have to re-provision them. They're just going to lose some of the roles they had, and those remap into faculty. And so part of that is, don't think of it from a technology perspective. What do you want the role to look like? So if you were doing this purely from a pen and paper type approach, what rights do they have to start with? And what do they have when they end? And if I move them back, I usually use what's called a persona matrix for this. Is let's talk about the class of users that we have. And here's the permissions I want. Here's the behavior I want, right? And again, you can tell I don't talk so much about the technology. I talk about it in terms from the business. What are you trying to achieve in this role? What are you trying to secure? And then if they switch roles in the org, what do I have to worry about? What do I have to pull back? What shouldn't they have? Or is it a, hey, if the student and a faculty ID merge like this for a period of time, or either one of the roles going to cancel something out, will they work? And when I pull that user back, can they still have their inbox? Do we have to pull any data? I don't have to worry about PII and FERPA and all these other wonderful acronyms from the government. But the reality is it's looking at, yep, you got it, Dale, established hierarchy and understanding what that flow is. And this is where IAM and access management and access provisioning come into play. So IAM and IAP is so that you could map this out. And again, it comes back to, if anyone's interested, more than willing to share my persona guidance that I have. I do it for workstations. I do it for users, whether they're an admin or a just a generic user. And the reason being is to get people to think about what's the behavior they want. And then we work through the policy that's going to support it, or the products, right? Because part of this is about looking at, this is the behavior I want to affect in the organization. I know the Microsoft sales team came in and gave me this whole list of great stuff, but I can't tell you how many times I've been on a call. Well, we bought A5. Yeah. Well, what do you want to deploy? Well, we want to deploy A5. A5 is 30 some products, guys. Why did you buy it? Well, the reports look great. Okay. So help me figure this out. And so then we take a completely different tack. So, okay, let's step back. What are you trying to solve from a security perspective that made you buy A5? And then they're like, oh, yeah, we want to block users from coming from out of North America. Okay, do you want to do this dynamically? Do you want to make a policy? How do you want to, what are our options? And then we start going through and digging it. And that kind of opens up the broader spectrum of, they start to see what's possible. And then we start looking at, okay, great. Your users are set up in a way that I can do this with one set of identities. Your admins have another set of identity for getting into sensitive stuff. We can prevent from malware attacks. We can isolate your tenant. Because as you guys all probably are aware, most of the attacks in the infrastructure are coming from endpoints. And so like when someone buys M365 A5, first thing I do is let's just roll out Defender. Well, why are we going to do that? Let's see what's out there. I want to see how your systems behave. So, oh God, and now I got to remember, it is traditionally done with OUs. I want to call it management groups, admin groups. It's a similar structure. A lot of the hierarchy too is coming back. You guys are probably all familiar with RBAC or role-based access controls. They're finally getting to the point where we got it in Azure, but it's been a long time coming in M365. I think you can get it in Exchange and SharePoint now. They're rolling it out to the rest of the service, but that could be a topic for another call. Because I know I've just burned through 30 minutes like you.
And see, I knew you would, TH. So 30 minutes goes real fast, and I can see that there is a lot of engagement in the chat around what you've been talking about. So it sounds like we're definitely gonna need to have you back again. One of our favorite guests, Steve Lane, just said, I can stay for another 60 minutes. But I think that wraps us up for today. Heather?
That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, TH, for being on here. We will absolutely, if we need to maybe bump into June 1 extra week in order to get
Sure.
TH back, we'll make it happen, because y'all we're very, very excited. Oh, they want to know what the last slide is, TH, because you only showed, there you go. Okay, so we will make sure that we'll get this. I'll sit here and get the recording posted so that anybody who needs it can have it right away. But thank you so much, and we will get him back on our calendar ASAP for every one of you, because clearly this went well. So thank you very much.
I mean, look at those hearts.
I
Wow.
know. We will see
fantastic.
everyone again next week. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate that you choose to show up and spend this hour with us every single week. So we will all talk soon. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Great job,
Nice
TH.
to meet
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.